So another part of Hermeneutics 501 that I want to talk about is the area of what is called cultural hermeneutics. And again, this is a massive area, one that I know a little bit about, but I'm very aware that there's a lot more I can learn about this. The people who are often doing the most thoughtful work on this are actually people in missiology, which is not my area of training and nor tons of experience, but I've learned from them and have had conversations and read some things related to this. But I want to approach it in a particular cultural hermeneutic way, just to say that, again, part of what we need to do to become excellent readers of the Gospels is be aware of some of these issues that are affecting us and help us read well. So the first thing I want to say in cultural hermeneutics comes from the work of a great scholar, a Lutheran scholar who has produced much over many decades, a guy called Mark Allen Powell, and particularly a little book he wrote called What Do They Hear? Bridging the Gap Between Pulpit and Pew. What do they hear? Bridging the Gap Between Pulpit and Pew. And it's very interesting insights. And again, like all books, you have to read it, from your own perspective and figure out things you'd agree and disagree with. That's no problem. But I think there's some things that we can learn from Powell in this. And it comes from an experience that he had as a teacher and an experiment he did with the famous prodigal son story of Luke 15. And what he did is he assigned assorted students to just read that story. I mean, he would do this in his classes, read the story, and then recount it from memory, And particularly interesting, what he found is that many people, that particularly Luke 15:14, which says, and after he had spent everything, a severe famine struck that country and he had nothing. That verse, he found that when he did this experiment with American seminary students, that none of them related that in their retelling. So in other words, if you're, he'd say, read the story now, either write it, usually I think he probably did it in the form of writing, write out what you think the story said. None of the American students remembered or mentioned Luke 15:14 as part of the retelling of their story. So he broadened the story to 100 American students of a mixed group, and only 6 of them then mentioned the famine as he expanded it. And so then one time he was teaching in St. Petersburg, Russia, and he did the very same experiment, and he found that 42 of the 50 students, when they retold the prodigal son story, they mentioned the famine. 42 of 50, so at 84% of them. While at the same time, very few of the Russian students made reference to the prodigal son squandering his property, which is something that a lot of times the American students would highlight. The Americans tended to see the squandering of the property, which is what the word prodigal actually means. Prodigality means the sort of foolish spreading out, so the prodigal son does this. The Americans generally saw that as the issue, where the Russians tended to see the tragedy of the famine as the issue. The Russians' view was, generally the students, was that the son's problem was his leaving of the family and forsaking it. His sin was wanting to be self-sufficient, which was foolish. But, to quote Powell, in a capitalist society, we see the prodigal's sin in terms of his wastefulness. In a socialist society, the Russians see the prodigal's sin as self-sufficiency. That's very interesting. Now, the big point for us is that we are often oblivious to what we are bringing to the process of interpretation. In a previous lecture, I talked about the questions you ask of the text or the answers you get, and our tradition influences those questions. This is the point here, that we are coming from with certain cultural presuppositions and personal assumptions that are not bad and it can't be avoided. It doesn't mean we can't read God's Word, but it does mean that we're going to tend to interpret a story differently. The same thing is also happening to people, it's good to remember, as we teach or preach. I preach regularly, and it's always good to remember that what I think I'm saying is going to be received by a lot of different people based on their cultural and personal assumptions as well and their own narratives. That's inevitable, and again, it doesn't mean we can't communicate. It doesn't mean we can't read, doesn't mean we can't preach or teach. It just means it's helpful as we get a little bit more in depth into being teachers and readers, good readers, that we're aware of this cultural hermeneutical issue. Another point to make is that, in my opinion, it's not always possible, nor is it certainly always able to distinguish or choose that only one of these readings is necessarily superior over the other, or it may be better to say it's not necessarily that a Latin American reading versus a Russian reading versus a United States reading You can't easily say that one of those is right and all the others are wrong. We might still discern and say this is better or worse based on grammatical work and historical work. That's all valid, and the three avenues that I've talked about is there. But it's also good just to remember that at a more fundamental level, or a higher level, we might say, there's a kind of sensitivity and a sensibility of how to read a text and how to apply it that is going to vary, and that we shouldn't just think of it in terms of this reading is right and all these others are wrong. In fact, when you do that, especially from a North American perspective, especially a United States perspective, it's just good to remember, my reading and my way of reading of text isn't necessarily superior to that of a Chinese brother or a Puerto Rican sister or a Brazilian grandmother. I mean, all of them, there may be ways in which I can read better and have more skill set, but they also have sensibilities that I may not have, and that's important, and we'll talk about that more when we come to the posture sort of idea. So this is just a helpful experiment to kind of introduce this idea of cultural hermeneutics, that we need to be aware that we are conditioned, and that culture is not a bad thing necessarily, but it can help us ask certain questions, and it's good to be aware of other people's questions as well. And that leads into the other thing I want to say about cultural hermeneutics, another book I'd highly recommend to you by a guy named Nabil Jabbour, Jabbour, and the book is called The Crescent Through the Eyes of the Cross, and it comes from Nav Press in 2008. And Nabil Jabbour is an Arab Christian who spent many years ministering in the gospel to Muslims, and he's learned a lot along the way. And chapters 10 and 11 of his book discuss the very important idea of sort of cultural and theological paradigms and how they affect our reading of Scripture. And he notes that there are four big biblical paradigms that are up and running, cultural paradigms that are already in the Bible. And he mentions these. They are guilt, righteousness. They're in a set of binary pairs. Guilt and righteousness, shame and honor, defilement and clean, or purity or impurity, and then fear and power. Now, what Jabbour, and he points out biblical examples of all of these sort of cultural values and opposites. The big idea is that the Bible actually traffics in all of these paradigms and uses them at different times and places. Different cultures and subcultures then tend to emphasize one of these more than another. And here's the point. In the West, especially since the Protestant Reformation, for most of us, there's almost only been one of those four that is how we read the Bible. And that is which one? It's the guilt righteousness paradigm. That is, when we think about what the gospel is, when we read the Bible, we read it almost exclusively as about our personal guilt and sin, and then the righteousness that God imputes to us through Christ. And of course, that's true. And that's clearly there in the Bible. That's a major emphasis, and that's at the core of what the gospel is. There's no doubt about that. But the point is that that's actually not the only paradigm through which the Bible depicts reality, not the only sort of binary set of ideas, nor is it the one that actually throughout all of church history, or even today, is the primary one instead. And in fact, you could argue that while that guilt righteousness paradigm is clearly there, it particularly becomes the focus for the reformers, because they were functioning in a time and place where that legal terminology and the way of viewing ethics or morality as about duty to law had become dominant, especially in the late medieval period with what are called the manualists, and that's a whole other discussion. But the point is, the reformers are rightly emphasizing that we can't earn our way and we can't get rid of our guilt by doing things. We need God to give us His righteousness and to transform us by His grace. That's absolutely true, but the point is that's not the only thing the Bible talks about. And in fact, it's not the only cultural paradigm, and to push it even a little farther, for many, many people outside of the West, that paradigm actually doesn't do much for them. And I've talked to many missionaries, especially in the Middle East and others, that when you talk about guilt to a Muslim person, or that they're sinful, that idea doesn't have the same kind of traction that it does for you and me who are in the West, have a very sensitive conscience and have a very legal understanding that we've broken laws and therefore we're guilty. For a Muslim, from what I understand, is that to be a sinner means you do all these horrible things, and that they're not a sinner if you're not a drunk and an adulterer and others, that's not how they function in terms of thinking. Now you might say, well, they need to be instructed correctly. Well, that's certainly true, but Jabor's point is more nuanced and more helpful, I think, than just that sort of simple answer, and that is to recognize that there are other ways the Bible also talks about God and His work in these other cultural paradigms. Again, shame, honor. That's a huge one throughout all of the ancient Near Eastern cultures, throughout most cultures today, Japanese and various African countries as well, Islam certainly in Mediterranean countries. The idea that shame and honor is a crucial part of the cultural fabric and the very DNA of people is something in the West we don't have as much of. But the idea that in every part of society, people are above other people, and that honor is something that you owe to those above you. And if you give shame to those above you, then that results in, that's like the main sin you could do, is shame or dishonor those above you. And instead, you want to honor those, and then people will give you charis or grace in this sort of relationship. And there's a whole important discussion about this whole idea of honor and shame, or clean and unclean, or fear and power. And what Jabor does in this book is he goes through the Gospels and he shows that, yeah, there are guilt righteousness passages and discussions, but a lot of the gospel stories really make sense not from that cultural paradigm of guilt righteousness, as true as that is, but they only make sense if you think about it in terms of honor, shame, clean, unclean, fear, power. So for example, as a couple examples, Luke 11, 5-8, which we think about being a story about persistence in prayer. Remember this? But from a different sort of cultural perspective, this can be understood as about boldness. We can be bold to ask God for blessings and provision because it is actually built on the honor-shame issue. God's honor is at stake, that if we implore Him as our benefactor, that He would provide for us. That's a little different way of reading it. In fact, it kind of makes sense of the anideia word that's there in Luke 11, and the idea of hospitality and the importance of that as an honor-shame issue in culture, ancient Near Eastern culture. It's a very different kind of reading. It's not a contradictory reading, but it's an insight that comes from that cultural difference. Or examples from Mark 5 that Jabor gives. For example, in 5:1-20 of Mark, he shows that Jesus' interaction with the demons, that's really a story not about guilt righteousness, but about Jesus as having power over fear and about over other powers in the world. And Jabor points out that in much of folk Islam, for example, the idea of these jinn, these powers, these good jinn and evil jinn and neutral jinn that are to be feared, that influence all that happens in the world, and that anyone who's reading from that cultural perspective is going to immediately see that Mark 5:1-20, that's what it's talking about. It's presenting Jesus as superior over all powers that might cause them fear. That insight makes a lot more sense of that text than how we might tend to read it. Or following on in 5:21-34 of Mark with the story of the hemorrhaging woman, the real issue there is that she is unclean and Jesus is providing cleansing for her. And that she is also in a place of shame because of her situation, and so Jesus is providing honor to her. Those cultural paradigms make a lot more sense of what's going on in that story. And then finally, the Jairus' daughter story that follows is again another one of Jesus' power over the things that would cause us fear. So the big point again, and there's so much more that could be said, and missiologists and sociologists and anthropologists all have a lot of good things to say about these issues. But the big point for us is that we need to be aware of these different paradigms of not only guilt righteousness is how you and I tend to read texts, but also shame and honor, clean and unclean, fear and power, because the Bible actually traffics in all of them, not just the guilt righteousness one. And that when we share the gospel with people, we need to meet them where they are, not only in other cultures, but in our culture as well, and recognize that culture is changing and the Bible is able to speak to all of these issues. The gospel, you see, not only provides forensic forgiveness and justification, but it also very clearly provides freedom from shame and guilt, freedom from fear, in fact, giving us great power, I think of Colossians and Ephesians, and freedom from defilement or uncleanness. And so the point of this whole thing is that, yet again, it's helpful as we grow in our hermeneutical abilities and learn to read well to recognize that we can learn from other cultures and we can learn from these other ideas of reading the Bible more wisely by being more sensitive to these cultural hermeneutical issues.